ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that Willow had always prided herself on being a person of control, calm, and calculated precision. But as time passed, a subtle shift occurred in her, something dark and undeniable. It began with small manipulations, slight adjustments to the way she interacted with Drew, the way she handled their situation. At first, it was all about keeping Drew calm, ensuring his recovery, and making sure everything remained under her control. But now, that control was slowly slipping into something more sinister. Drew had been unconscious for so long, and Willow's actions were masked as acts of care. She had become his anchor, his lifeline. At least that's how she presented herself. But in reality, Willow was playing a dangerous game. Every decision she made, every choice she took for Drew, was carefully constructed to serve her own ends. It was subtle at first, with whispers of doubt, little suggestions to Drew about what he should remember, what he should trust. Yet, as Drew began to regain his strength, Willow's true intentions started to emerge. Drew's mind was clearing, and with every passing day, he began to fight for his independence, reclaiming control over his own life and decisions. He had once always been a man of conviction, a leader in his own right, and no amount of Willow's subtle manipulation could erase that. He wasn't the same man who had been lying in a hospital bed. As his consciousness grew stronger, Drew's ability to see through Willow's intentions became sharper. It didn't take long for him to realize that the woman he had trusted, the one who claimed to care for him, had begun to take liberties, more than just in his care, but in his life, his future, and his legacy. Willow's actions were becoming more desperate, her desire to control Drew's fate growing more pronounced. She had long dreamed of claiming his family's fortune, the inheritance that would secure her position in the world. But now, with Drew beginning to wake up, with his mind clearing, she feared that her carefully laid plans would fall apart. She had already made moves to manipulate his will, steering him toward decisions that suited her own ambitions, but Drew was starting to see the cracks in her story. His growing suspicion turned to confrontation. When Drew began to press Willow for answers, for clarity on the decisions she has been making, it was clear that she was no longer the compassionate caretaker. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Drew's strength, his ability to question her, was throwing her into a frenzy. For the first time, Willow was losing control, and that scared her more than anything else. As Drew fought to reclaim his rightful place in his family, the inheritance that Willow had long coveted now seemed impossible to take. His recovery was more than physical. It was a reclaiming of his power, his autonomy. The truth about what Willow had been up to was beginning to surface, and the shocking realization that she had been plotting to control his legacy sent a shiver down Drew's spine. The stakes were higher than ever. What had started as a quiet manipulation was now a full-fledged battle for Drew's future and for Willow. It was a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Her attempts to control Drew were being met with resistance at every turn. The more she fought to regain his agency, the more desperate Willow became. She had thought she could control him with kindness and deception, but Drew wasn't the man she had hoped to bend to her will. He was now fully aware of her schemes, and that made the situation more volatile than ever. The shockwaves of her actions were only just beginning to ripple through their lives, and the consequences of Willow's ambition would soon come crashing down on her.
Drew's awakening from his long period of unconsciousness was more than just a return to the physical world. His mind, once clouded by injury, had begun to clear, and with it came the sharp realization that his life had been under the control of someone he trusted. Willow had been the one constant, the one person who had remained by his side during his darkest hours, but now, as he regained his senses, he began to see the manipulation that had quietly taken root. At first, Drew hadn't noticed. He was weak, struggling to regain his strength, and Willow's careful, nurturing presence seemed like a lifeline. She made decisions for him, guided him, protected him. But as his mind returned, the questions started. He began to notice the small things, decisions made without his input, things that fell off, and most notably, the way she had maneuvered herself into a position of control over his life. It wasn't just about his recovery anymore. It was about his future, his legacy, and Willow had been steering it without him even realizing it. The more Drew thought about it, the more it became clear Willow had been playing a dangerous game. The inheritance, the family legacy that had once been his to control, had been subtly altered by her. The will, the documents, things he had never questioned before had all been tampered with. Drew's memories came rushing back, and with them, The painful truth of how he had been manipulated by the very person who had been entrusted with his care. Willow wasn't just looking after him, she was looking after her own future, and it was all tied to him. What had started as small, innocent actions, decisions about his health, his estate had turned into something much darker. Willow had calculated every move, playing the role of the dutiful caretaker, but in reality, she was positioning herself to inherit everything Drew had once held dear. She had used his vulnerability, his trust, and in the process, she had slowly eroded his control over his own life. It wasn't just about the money, it was about power. Willow wanted to control Drew's legacy, his family's wealth, and she had been using him as a pawn in her plan all along. As Drew's strength returned, so did his resolve. He wasn't the same man who had been lying helplessly in that hospital bed. His mind, his spirit were awake now, and he would not allow Willow to continue her scheme. The realization hit him hard. The woman he had trusted, the one who had claimed to love him, had been manipulating him from the very beginning. Drew was furious, and rightfully so. He had been betrayed in the most intimate way possible, and he would not let Willow get away with it. When Drew confronted Willow, the shock on her face was evident. She had thought she was untouchable, that her control over him was absolute. She had underestimated his strength, his willpower. But now, with Drew awake and fully aware, the balance of power had shifted. The confrontation was intense as Drew demanded answers, but Willow, ever the manipulator, tried to spin her actions as though they were in his best interest. She tried to justify the decisions she had made for him, convincing him that it was all done out of love, out of care. But Drew wasn't buying it anymore. For Drew, the most painful part was not the physical betrayal, it was the emotional manipulation. Willow had used his weakness to reshape his future, to align his will with her desires. And now that he could see it clearly, the weight of it was overwhelming. He had trusted her completely, and she had taken advantage of that trust. Drew wasn't going to let her control him anymore. But for Willow, the shock was palpable. She had always been the one in control, pulling the strings, making the decisions. But now as Drew's power returned, so did the pressure on her. The facade she had built, the trust she had cultivated, began to crumble. Drew wasn't simply taking back his inheritance, he was reclaiming his autonomy, his identity. And Willow was left to face the consequences of her manipulations. Willow could feel the walls closing in on her. Drew's anger was justified, and yet she couldn't deny the pressure mounting in her chest. She had underestimated him. She had thought that once he woke up, once he recovered, he would simply be grateful to her for everything she had done. But now he wasn't just grateful, he was furious. And she could see the determination in his eyes. He was not going to let her get away with this. The more Drew pushed for answers, the more Willow realized how deep the hole she had dug for herself truly was. She had overplayed her hand, and now Drew wasn't just challenging her decisions, he was taking control of his life, his legacy, and his future. The pressure on Willow was immense. The one person she had carefully controlled was now the one person she couldn't control anymore. The battle for Drew's future had begun, and Willow found herself in the fight of her life. But the true shock was still to come. Willow had hoped that her influence over Drew would go unnoticed, that he would never question her, never see what she had been doing. But now, with Drew awake and fully aware, Willow realized that the control she had so carefully crafted was slipping through her fingers. The more Drew fought for his independence, the more desperate Willow became to hold on to the power she had once possessed. She tried to convince him that she was looking out for him, that her actions were in his best interest. But Drew was too far gone. The damage was done. Willow's desperation grew. She tried to play the victim to make Drew feel guilty for questioning her motives, but it was no use. Drew wasn't the man she had manipulated anymore. He was strong, resolute, and determined to take back what was rightfully his. The inheritance, the legacy, the power, it was all slipping away from Willow, and the more she fought to hold on to it, the more she realized that Drew's strength was not something she could control. As Drew moved forward, reclaiming his life, his autonomy, and his future, Willow was left to deal with the consequences of her actions. The walls were closing in, and she knew that no amount of manipulation could save her now. Drew was awake, and with his awakening came the return of his power. The power to reclaim everything Willow had tried to take from him. What had started as a subtle manipulation had now exploded into a full-blown battle for control, and Willow was losing. Drew wasn't just taking back his inheritance, he was taking back his life, and there was nothing Willow could do to stop it. Drew had always prided himself on being in control, both in his professional life and in his personal relationships. But when it came to Willow, he had allowed himself to trust too deeply, to become vulnerable in ways that made him question everything. Now that he was awake, his mind clear once again, Drew's perspective on everything had shifted, especially on Willow. The love Drew had for Willow had always been genuine, intense, and unwavering. He had believed that she cared for him, that she had his best interests at heart. In the early days of his recovery, when he was at his weakest and most vulnerable, Willow had been his anchor. She had nursed him back to health, supported him when he couldn't do anything for himself, and kept him grounded when his mind wandered. It was easy to fall into the belief that she was his lifeline, that she was the one who would protect him from the chaos of the world. But now, as his body healed and his mind cleared, Drew started to see things differently. Drew's love for Willow was still very much intact, but it was now colored by a growing realization. The woman who had cared for him so tenderly had in subtle ways manipulated him, his choices, his future, and even his family's wealth. He had trusted Willow with his life, but she had used that trust to position herself for a future that didn't just involve him, it involved the control she had quietly been building over his legacy. Drew wasn't blind to this, and as painful as it was, he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had been vulnerable, but he wasn't weak. He wasn't a puppet to be controlled. But Drew wasn't the kind of man who would lash out in anger. He wasn't interested in revenge or in tearing Willow down. His love for her was still powerful, still something that he held dear. He understood the complexities of their relationship, the sacrifices she had made, the care she had given. But understanding didn't mean he would allow her to control him. The dynamic between them had changed, and Drew knew he had to take control of his life again, their life, but in a way that allowed him to maintain his own autonomy. Willow, however, hadn't expected this shift. She had thought that Drew would return to her, that his dependency on her would remain, that he would rely on her to make the decisions for them both. But as Drew began to regain control of his future, he realized that he could no longer let Willow manipulate him, even if it was in ways that seemed for his own good. His legacy, his inheritance, and his decisions were his alone to make, and he could no longer allow her to act as the gatekeeper to everything he held dear. The first sign of Drew asserting his control came slowly. He started questioning her decisions more, asking for clarity about the choices she had made in his absence. He began to insist on being more involved in the decisions regarding his future, including his inheritance and the legacy of his family. Willow, who had always been the one in charge, felt a growing sense of unease. Drew wasn't being aggressive or hostile. He was simply making it clear that he would no longer be a passive participant in his own life. And that was the shock to Willow. She had thought her control over him was absolute, but Drew was proving her wrong. The tension grew as Drew began to take steps to restore his autonomy. He started working with his attorneys, reviewing the documents Willow had altered during his unconsciousness. Willow tried to rationalize her actions, claiming that she had only done what was best for him, but Drew wasn't swayed. His trust had been broken, and as much as he still loved her, he could no longer let her dictate the terms of his life. Drew took steps to reverse the changes Willow had made, reasserting his authority over his own estate and future. For Willow, this new development was a shock. She had never expected Drew to fight back to challenge her. She had carefully woven her influence into his life, positioning herself as the one person he could rely on. But now as Drew made decisions without consulting her, as he took steps to ensure his own control, Willow felt the ground shift beneath her. The very foundation of her plan was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The shock was particularly jarring because Drew's love for Willow hadn't disappeared, it had simply evolved. Drew still cared for her deeply. He still wanted to protect her, to cherish the love they had once shared. But he had come to the painful realization that love didn't mean relinquishing control over his own life. Love didn't mean allowing Willow to take advantage of his vulnerability. He had to reclaim his power, and in doing so, he had to make difficult choices that would affect their relationship forever. Willow's frustration grew as Drew took more and more control. She tried to placate him, to reason with him, but it became clear that she had underestimated the depth of his will. Drew wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let her hold the reins any longer. And this shift in their relationship was becoming increasingly apparent to both of them. For Drew, this was a necessary adjustment, a step toward reclaiming his autonomy. But for Willow, it was a devastating blow. The man she had carefully molded, the man she had once controlled, was now standing up for himself in a way she never imagined. As the weeks went by, Willow's shock turned to desperation. She could see that Drew was no longer the man she could manipulate. His decisions became more independent, more forceful. Every step he took away from her control was another blow to her carefully constructed plans. The inheritance she had once thought was in her grasp was now slipping away, and with it, so was the power she had tried so hard to secure. Drew wasn't the same man who had once been at her mercy. He was now a man who had reclaimed his future, and there was no turning back. Drew's love for Willow had never been a simple thing. It was deep, passionate, and enduring. But his love for himself, his need for autonomy, was stronger. And as he took control of his life again, he understood that love didn't mean surrendering who you were to someone else. Love was about mutual respect, about understanding the need for both people to stand as equals. Drew couldn't let Willow's manipulation continue, no matter how much he still cared for her. In the end, Drew's decision to reclaim control wasn't about hurting Willow. It was about ensuring that he could live his life on his terms. And while the love they shared was still there, it would never be the same. The power dynamic had shifted, and Drew was the one in charge of his destiny once again. For Willow, the shock of this shift was still settling in. But the reality was clear: Drew was no longer hers to control. He was his own man, and nothing, no amount of love or manipulation could change that.